The storm came first, wild, relentless, swallowing every trace of warmth in Evergreen. Then came the silence, and through that silence, he appeared. A German shepherd limping from the edge of the frozen woods, battered, bleeding, a crimson cap clenched in his jaws. He didn't bark, he didn't cry, but in his eyes burned a warning and a plea. Something was wrong, someone was missing. And as the wind howled and darkness fell, one truth became clear. This dog hadn't come to be saved. He had come to lead a rescue from God on 4 broken paws. The mountain town of Evergreen, Colorado, sat frozen beneath a thick blanket of snow and silence. The kind of silence that presses on your chest like a weight heavy with stillness and the unspoken fears that winter always brings. Snow had fallen steady for 3 days, piling high along rooftops, covering roads, softening even the sharpest sound. The air was dry and bitter, biting at any exposed skin like a warning. At the edge of the town, tucked between the towering pine trees and the last winding bend of Highway 74, stood the Evergreen Forest Service Station, a squat, weathered building of timber and stone, the roof sagging slightly from years of snowpack and smoke curling lazily from the old iron chimney. Inside, the lights buzzed low, casting a yellow glow on wood-paneled walls and faded trail maps. Sarah Delaney, the station supervisor, sat hunched over her desk near the back. One long leg propped on a stool, her fingers cradling a chipped mug of black coffee gone cold. She was in her late 30s, tall and willowy, with sharp cheekbones and skin that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. Her chestnut hair, streaked prematurely with silver, was twisted in a messy bun beneath a worn wool beanie. She had once been the kind of woman who laughed loudly, hugged tightly, and knew everyone in town by name. But that was before the accident, before the icy road took her daughter 3 winters ago and left only silence behind. Since then, she'd been quiet, dependable, and distant, a ghost with a ranger's badge. Across the room, leaning against a filing cabinet, was Marcus Bell, her junior partner. Mid-20s, sturdy and practical, with a dark goatee and the kind of warm brown eyes that made people instinctively trust him. He had transferred in from Durango 6 months ago, still new enough to knock on doors and introduce himself, but smart enough to keep his questions to himself when it came to Sarah. He respected her the way young men respect fire, beautiful, dangerous, and not to be touched. They were the only 2 working the night shift during the storm. Marcus was humming softly under his breath, flipping through a weather report when it happened. A low, rattling scratch at the door, barely audible over the wind, then again, louder, and again. Not the curious scrape of wind-blown branches or a lost raccoon. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Sarah froze mid-sip. Her eyes met Marcus's across the room. He stood first, grabbing the flashlight clipped to his belt, and moved to the door. The scratching stopped. When he opened it, the freezing wind rushed in like a scream, scattering papers and extinguishing the silence. And there, standing framed in the orange glow of the porch lamp, was a dog, not just any dog. A German shepherd, gaunt and wild-eyed, its fur a matted patchwork of ice, mud, and dried blood. One ear stood stiff, while the other drooped half-torn. The animal trembled slightly, not just from cold but from exhaustion. But its eyes, those eyes were bright, fierce, and determined, and clenched in its jaws like some terrible offering was a tiny knitted cap, bright red once, now soaked in frozen blood. The dog limped forward, dragging a back leg that refused to bend. It dropped the hat at Marcus's boots and looked up at him. Then, with a sharp bark, just one, it collapsed. Sarah was already moving. She knelt beside the creature without hesitation, her gloved hand brushing lightly along its side. The dog didn't flinch. Its ribs were visible through its fur, one paw bloodied and raw from travel. But it didn't whimper. It didn't cry. It just stared at her with those burning amber eyes waiting. She looked up at Marcus. "We need to follow it." Marcus hesitated. "Follow it where it can barely stand." Sarah stood, her voice low but steady. "It didn't come here by accident. That's not some random animal souvenir." She gestured to the bloody cap. "That's a message." She turned and began gathering gear, her parka boots flare, gun med kit. "Grab the truck. We've got maybe an hour before the snow starts again." Marcus was already moving. By the time the Forest Service pickup rattled to life, headlights cutting a narrow path through the snow, Ranger, because that's what they started calling him, almost instantly was bundled in the back, his head resting on a folded blanket, eyes half-lidded, but still alert. When Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, Ranger raised his head as if to say, "Now you're ready." No one questioned it, not the timing, not the dog, not the logic. Because sometimes Sarah thought you don't need words when the world gives you something this clear. 15 minutes later, the truck pulled off a service road onto a snow-covered trail near Aspen Hollow, a place no one used in winter. The old trail had been shut since a rock slide wiped out part of it 3 years ago. But Ranger stirred. He leapt from the truck bed with surprising grace for a wounded animal nose to the wind limping forward into the darkness between the trees. Sarah turned to Marcus. "You think we're insane yet?" He nodded, a little, but he knows where he's going. And without another word, they followed him. Into the woods, into the storm, into the beginning of something none of them could yet name. The forest closed in around them, like a living thing, branches hunched under snow trunks blackened with cold. Each step Sarah took crunched into the hardened snowpack, the weight of her boots matching the heaviness in her chest. Ahead of her, Ranger limped determinedly through the narrowing trail, his paw bleeding again, dark spots melting into the white like ink on paper. The deeper they went, the more the trees thickened. The path, if it could still be called, one was overgrown and silent. There was no wind now, only the sound of their breaths ragged and uneven, echoing faintly off the frozen trees. Sarah adjusted the strap of her pack and glanced back at Marcus, who was slightly behind his flashlight beam, sweeping low and slow. His face was flushed from the cold, dark stubble crusted with frost. He hadn't spoken much since they had left the truck, his usual good-natured energy dulled by the thick air of tension. But he walked with purpose. If Sarah noticed one thing about Marcus in the past few months, it was that he was reliable, even if he didn't always know what he was walking into. Ranger suddenly stopped, ears perked. Sarah moved closer, following his gaze. There, half buried under a snowdrift near the base of a pine, was something out-of-place fabric. She knelt and gently brushed the snow away with her gloves. It was a child's backpack, bright purple with faded patches shaped like stars. One strap was ripped, the zipper half opened. Inside she found a small stuffed elephant, its ear torn, and a juice box frozen solid. There were tiny gloves too, one missing. Sarah froze. Something tightened in her chest. Marcus crouched beside her, frowning. "That's recent? Last few days at most." Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her fingers hovered over the worn cloth of the elephant's back. The stitching reminded her of something. Or someone. Years ago, another forest. Another child. She stood abruptly, her voice colder than the wind. "There's blood!" Marcus followed her finger to the small crimson smear on the edge of the bag's strap. Shit. Ranger moved again, sniffing the air, then angled right away from the trail and toward a cluster of rocks that jutted out like broken teeth from the snow. He didn't bark, but his body tensed. Marcus and Sarah followed. As they climbed over the uneven ground, Sarah's boot slipped slightly on a patch of hidden ice. Marcus reached out instinctively and steadied her. "You all right?" She nodded quickly, brushing his hand off. "Yeah, keep going." But the truth was, she wasn't. Not really. Every step she took behind that dog seemed to peel away another layer of armor she'd spent years building. The smell of pine sap and frozen air reminded her of weekends long ago. Family camping trips. Her daughter's tiny hands clutching Sarah's coat as they hiked the trails together, the girl's laughter light as falling snow. Her name was Maddie, just 7 years old when the crash happened. A patch of black ice on the canyon road. Sarah wasn't driving, it didn't matter. Maddie had died in the hospital 3 days later. And her marriage, which had already been wearing thin from late shifts and missed birthdays, didn't survive the grief. Her husband Tom had tried, for a while. But sorrow has a way of building walls between people, and Sarah had shut every door. He moved away 2 years ago. She hadn't spoken to him since. Now, with a wounded German shepherd leading her deeper into the cold heart of the forest, she couldn't tell if she was chasing a child or running from a ghost. They crested the ridge and found themselves looking down into a narrow ravine where trees leaned over like mourners and the snow seemed untouched except for one thing. Footprints, small ones, too small to be adult, too deep for an animal, and stained in places with drops of red. Marcus inhaled sharply. "That's no rabbit trail." Ranger was already moving, limping along the edge of the prints like a soldier on patrol. He paused near a rock outcrop and looked back, waiting. Sarah's radio crackled suddenly. A voice filtered through, warped by static. "This is base. Storm front pushing. 3 hours max before visibility. Drop below safe, then nothing but wind and snow. Sarah clipped the radio back to her belt. We don't have much time. Just then, a sound stopped them both. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. Just a faint sobbing carried by the trees like a whisper. Marcus looked at Sarah. Did you hear that Ranger had already picked up speed, ignoring his limp diving between the trees like he'd found a scent again? They ran after him. Branches slapped their faces. Snow filled their boots. The crying grew louder, unmistakable now. Then Sarah saw it. A girl, no older than 6, crouched behind a boulder, her tiny arms wrapped around her knees, wearing only a light jacket and snow pants soaked through. Her lips were cracked, cheeks red raw. Tears froze on her face. One glove was missing. She was clutching the torn stuffed elephant from the bag. When she saw them, she didn't move, just stared wide-eyed and hollow. Ranger slowed, then approached gently, tail low. He didn't bark, he just pressed his nose against the girl's arm. She blinked, then whispered, "He came back." Sarah dropped to her knees beside her, pulling off her coat and wrapping it around the girl's shivering frame. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Liam," she said through chattering teeth. "He's my brother." Sarah's heart stopped. "Where is he?" The girl pointed into the woods toward the other side of the ravine. "He said he'd find help." Marcus pulled out the radio again, but it was dead. Signal's gone. Sarah stood. "We've got to move fast." They picked the girl up gently, Ranger staying pressed close to her side, guiding, guarding. He didn't flinch when her tiny hand curled into his fur. The storm was coming fast. The sky above was a heavy gray bruise, the wind picking up snow, drifting sideways. But Sarah didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt the fire again, the need to do something right, to save what could be saved. They were going to find Liam. They had to. The trees grew thicker as they pressed deeper into the forest branches, bending low under the weight of snow, their limbs creaking like bones in the cold. The little girl Sophie, they had learned her name, was clung tightly to Sarah's coat, wrapped in layers of borrowed warmth and silent fear. Her cheeks were raw, her nose red, but her eyes had begun to blink with recognition, like a lamp slowly regaining its flame. Sarah carried Sophie in her arms, despite the strain on her back, determined not to let the child touch the snow again. The girl was too light unnaturally so, and that terrified Sarah more than anything. Ranger moved beside them, head low, scanning the woods as if expecting the trees themselves to shift. Marcus moved ahead, clearing a path with his boots and flashlight, his voice occasionally calling back, "This way looks passable," or "Hold tight, we're almost at the ridge." But even his optimism was strained now. The temperature had dropped further. Snow was falling again, not thick yet, but in that insidious silent way that always meant more was coming. Sophie had fallen asleep against Sarah's shoulder, but when they reached the clearing, just before the old stone ravine, her eyes fluttered open and she whispered hoarsely, "He went down there." The ravine was narrow and steep with jagged rocks forming uneven walls on either side. A frozen stream snaked at the bottom, more ice than water. It was maybe 15 feet deep, an impossible climb for a child, especially in this weather. They didn't hesitate. Sarah handed Sophie gently to Marcus, then knelt at the edge. "We need to get down there now. Help me anchor the rope." Marcus nodded. "I'll go down. You stay with the girl." But Sarah was already looping her climbing rope around a pine stump, her hands moving fast, practiced, despite the cold numbing her fingers. "You're better with a radio." "I go." He didn't argue. As she lowered herself into the ravine, the cold seemed to wrap around her neck like a noose. Ice cracked beneath her boots. Frost bit through her gloves. Ranger appeared above her, pacing back and forth, at the edge, like a sentinel, unwilling to let her go alone. When her boots finally hit the bottom, the silence hit harder. It was a deeper quiet than the woods above, muffled by the walls, heavy with something unspoken. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the forest or the wind. Crying. Faint, hoarse, barely more than a breath. She turned her head toward the eastern wall of the ravine. A narrow crevice opened there like a cracked mouth in the rock. It was barely tall enough for an adult to crouch through. She ducked inside, flashlight flickering as it caught on the damp stone walls, and called out softly, "Hello, can you hear me?" A cough answered her, followed by a thin, trembling voice. "I'm here, please. I'm cold." She turned the final bend and saw him. A boy maybe 6 hunched in the corner of the cave, wrapped in a thin fleece hoodie now soaked through with snowmelt. His cheeks were ghostly pale, his lips tinged blue. He clutched a boot in his arms as if it were a blanket, and his eyes, brown and glassy, locked onto hers, like someone surfacing from underwater. "I'm Liam," he whispered. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him and wrapped the emergency blanket from her pack around his small frame. "You're safe now, Liam. We've got your sister. You're going to be okay." He leaned into her touch, his body trembling so violently it rattled her own chest. Then, as if remembering something vital, he looked up again, his eyes widening. "She's still in the cave." Sarah blinked. "Sophie." "No, she's with us." He shook his head slowly. "Not Sophie. The other girl." Sarah's breath caught. "What other girl?" Liam pointed deeper into the rock wall, toward another passage, this one even narrower. "She had the red jacket. I followed her, but she never came back." Sarah looked down at him, her instincts screaming in two directions. Get this boy to safety now, and find out what he just said. She reached for her radio, but it only hissed static. "I'm going to get you out of here," she whispered. "We'll talk more once you're safe." She carried Liam back through the crevice, his tiny arms looped weakly around her neck. At the edge of the ravine, Marcus and Ranger were waiting. Marcus holding the rope taut with both hands. Together, they hoisted the boy to safety. Liam clung to his sister the moment he saw her, his cries muffled in her coat. Sarah climbed out next, exhausted her muscles, screaming, but her mind elsewhere. That red jacket, that other girl. She didn't say anything aloud, not yet, but her thoughts spun like falling snow. Could it be another child? A ghost? A memory trapped in a place where silence reigned? They didn't have time to process it. The storm was moving in fast. Marcus managed to raise base on the radio for a second, just enough to share coordinates and request emergency evac. It would take at least 45 minutes. In the meantime, they moved the children into a thicket of evergreens that offered the best shelter. Marcus began setting up a thermal blanket lean-to. Sarah knelt beside Liam, brushing snow from his hair. He was still trembling, but his color was coming back. Ranger lay beside him, pressing his body gently to the boy's side. His tail thumped once. His fur was wet, his eyes tired, but he refused to move. Sarah looked at him. "Good boy," she whispered, and for just a second she swore she saw Ranger's eyes close, not from fatigue, but from peace. As if this moment, this child's warmth against his side, was what he had been searching for all along. Snow fell heavier now, each flake slow and deliberate, layering over every inch of forest in quiet burial. In the evergreen thicket, Sophie and Liam huddled beneath thermal blankets, their cheeks beginning to flush with returning warmth. Marcus stayed with them, his hands busy maintaining the makeshift shelter, his eyes flicking often toward the tree line. The storm hadn't yet reached full fury, but it would. Soon. Sarah stood at the ravine's edge again, her breath fogging in front of her like ghostly tendrils. She should have felt relief. The children were alive, the evac team was en route, but Liam's final words clung to her like frost. She had the red jacket, a girl deeper in the cave, forgotten, imagined left behind. Ranger paced restlessly near her side, his head kept turning to the east ears, twitching at sounds she couldn't hear. He didn't whine, didn't bark, but his tail stood low and stiff alert, focused. Sarah's boots sank into the snow as she stepped toward the ravine's lip again. She clipped herself back into the rope line, without hesitation, felt the harness catch her waist with its familiar grip. She glanced once at Marcus. "Stay here. Radio if you hear the chopper. I won't go far. You shouldn't go alone," he said, voice taut. But he didn't try to stop her. "Take the dog." Ranger was already at her side. They descended quickly, snow slipping from the ridge like loose sand. The entrance to the narrow crevice loomed again, the darkness inside it somehow more ominous now, knowing it may hold more than shadows. Sarah crouched to enter Ranger ducking beside her. His fur brushed against the walls, damp with meltwater. She could feel his body heat close to her leg. A strange comfort. The cave narrowed, widened, then split in two. The right path led back to where they had found Liam. She took the left. Inside was silence. Cold, damp silence that pressed into her skin. The beam of her flashlight bounced off glistening rock and glimmering frost. Ranger stopped suddenly, nose to the ground. He sniffed, then moved forward, turning once to make sure she followed. She did. Then the drawings began. At first, they were barely visible chalk scrawls on wet stone lines smeared by time and dripping condensation. But as they moved deeper, the images grew bolder, loops and stars, stick figures with wide eyes and smiling mouths. A heart. A child's name scribbled awkwardly in red Ellie. Sarah crouched and touched the edge of the drawing. Red chalk, a color every mother knew too well. She was here, she whispered. The cave widened slightly into a chamber no larger than a kitchen. The air was still. Ranger sniffed along the edge of the chamber wall and stopped at a spot near the floor. He pawed once, then twice. Sarah lowered her flashlight. More chalk marks, tiny fingerprints, and next to them, scratches, deep, ragged, claw-like. Not from a child, not made in play. She felt something catch in her throat. That's when the memory came. A cabin up in Estes Park 4 winters ago. She'd taken Maddie for a weekend escape, just the two of them. Snowmen and cocoa, sledding and songs. Maddie had drawn hearts on the windows, with her finger-pressed kisses into Sarah's woolen coat, and whispered stories about imaginary friends who lived in icicles and pine trees. On the drive back, they'd spun off the road. Maddie had called for her as the car flipped, and Sarah had reached for her too late. She had carried that sound ever since. Now, here in the cold belly of the mountain, it surfaced again, raw and terrible and human. A sob broke from Sarah's chest. She sank to her knees, her forehead touching stone arms, trembling. Ranger stood silently beside her. He did not move. He did not whine. He simply waited. Sarah cried not with violence, but with surrender. Her grief melted into the cave floor, her breath hitching in the silence like a prayer. When she finally raised her head, Ranger was there, pressing his muzzle softly to her shoulder. "I couldn't save her," Sarah whispered. Ranger looked at her, and in his eyes there was no judgment, only understanding. A sound broke the moment, a faint rustle. A breath. Sarah shot upright. Ranger's ears pricked. From behind a second stone wall partially collapsed came the quiet scraping of movement. Sarah crossed quickly, heart-hammering, flashlight trembling. She crouched and peered through a narrow gap in the stones. There in the half-light was a girl. She was curled into herself, like a fern in frost wrapped in a red puffer jacket now stained with dirt and time. Her blonde hair was tangled around her cheeks. She looked maybe 8. Her lips were cracked, her skin blotchy with cold, but she was breathing. Sarah reached for her. "Sweetheart, it's okay. I'm here." The girl flinched, then slowly opened her eyes. Blue, wild with fear. But then she saw Ranger. He stepped forward, gently lowering his head. She blinked. "You found me?" she whispered. Sarah used her multi-tool to widen the opening, careful not to disturb the fragile pile of stones that had half-trapped the girl. It took time, but finally Sarah reached in and lifted her free. The girl clung to her without a sound, burying her face in Sarah's coat. "What's your name?" Sarah asked softly. "Ellie." Sarah smiled through the lump in her throat. "That's a beautiful name." They made their way back slowly, Ranger flanking them like a guardian from some ancient story. The storm had thickened outside the cave, but when they emerged, Marcus was waiting, his face breaking into disbelief as he saw the child in Sarah's arms. Before he could speak, the distant thump of rotor blades filled the air. "Rescue team!" he shouted, raising a flare. Sarah turned to look back once toward the cave. The drawings remained behind, but something else had been left there too. Her guilt, her silence, her unshed tears. Ellie was alive, and maybe that meant Sarah could be too. The thrum of the helicopter faded into the distance, leaving behind a quiet so complete it felt unnatural. Snow drifted in slow spirals between the trees, and the forest seemed to hold its breath once more. Sarah watched the rescue team disappear into the sky, with Ellie the girl's final glance lingering on Ranger, who stood motionless as if carved from stone. The dog's coat was matted with ice, and his paw bled openly now, but his eyes stayed fixed on a point beyond the trees. Sarah knew that look. He wasn't done. Back at the shelter site, Marcus had begun packing the remaining gear, casting cautious glances toward Sarah as she stood beside the dog. "We've got the kids out," he said, breath visible in the cold. "Shouldn't that be it?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes followed Ranger's line of sight deep into the thicker pines, a place untouched by trail or map. "Liam said someone brought them out here," she murmured. "That means someone's still here." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. You think there are more? Sarah met his gaze. I think Ranger does. They moved north following the dog's lead. Ranger's gait was slower now, limping more heavily, but he didn't stop. He led them across frozen streams under fallen branches past trees whose roots clung to rocks like desperate fingers. The air grew colder the deeper they went until their breath came ragged and sharp. The snow muffled every sound except the crunch of boots and the low thump of Ranger's paw. Finally, they reached a shadow tucked beneath a ridge, an entrance half hidden by snow-draped branches and lichen-covered stone. A narrow cave mouth low and wide, a wound in the side of the earth. Sarah paused at the edge, shining her flashlight into the black. The beam disappeared in darkness, swallowed whole. Ranger stepped forward without hesitation. Sarah followed. Marcus came last, his radio crackling faintly with static. The tunnel twisted sharply, then opened into a sloping chamber filled with ancient stone. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic ticks. Their lights passed over rock formations, glinting with frost. Then Ranger stopped. A sound barely audible rose from the shadows. A child's voice. Weak. Help! Sarah and Marcus spun toward the source. Ranger advanced again, his head low, tail stiff. A large boulder had cracked off the cave ceiling and landed atop a rock shelf, forming a makeshift tomb. From within the gap came the voice again. Sarah dropped to her knees, flashlight trembling. She aimed the beam into the dark crevice and saw a face dirt-streaked, blood-specked, and terrified. "Hey there," she said gently, reaching a gloved hand toward the narrow opening. "You're okay now." The girl inside coughed, flinching. Her green eyes were wide. "My name's Olivia," she whispered. The rocks fell. I couldn't move. Sarah's throat tightened. "We're going to get you out." Marcus was already unpacking tools from his bag, handing Sarah a folding shovel and a compact crowbar. They cleared smaller stones first, but the slab over Olivia was too heavy to lift without leverage. Sarah tried to wedge the bar beneath it, but couldn't get the angle. That's when Ranger began to dig. He threw himself at the base of the rock, clawing at the packed dirt nails, tearing blood smearing into the snow and stone. "Ranger, stop!" Sarah shouted, trying to pull him back. But he wouldn't listen. Olivia's hand reached out, brushing his fur. "He was with Liam," she murmured. "He came back for me." Sarah and Marcus worked faster. Together, they managed to shift the slab just enough for Sarah to squeeze her arms inside and pull Olivia free. The girl was trembling, barely able to stand, but she clung to Sarah like an anchor. Her red jacket was torn, one sleeve missing, her boots soaked. But she was alive. Sarah wrapped her in a heat blanket and helped her sit. "It's over now," she whispered. Olivia shook her head. "No, it's not. He's still out there." Sarah blinked. "Who?" Olivia's voice cracked. "The man. He said he was taking us to a secret fort, that he had toys and food. He said it would be fun." Marcus's jaw tightened. Did he have a name? He never said. Olivia pulled the blanket tighter. He got mad when Liam asked to go home. Then I fell. He left me there. Sarah sat back on her heels. Her breath felt heavy in her lungs. This wasn't just a group of kids getting lost. Marcus nodded. This was deliberate. They both looked at Ranger. He lay on the cave floor, his head down, breath coming shallowly. His paw was torn open, muscles trembling, but his eyes were clear, focused, still watching the dark. They weren't finished. The light was fading fast. The sky above the treetops dimmed to a pale gray blue, bruised with approaching nightfall. Snow still clung to the branches, but had slowed to a gentle drift. Ranger lay resting near the cave's mouth, his body curled tight tail, twitching occasionally, breath labored but even. Sarah knelt beside him, checking the bleeding on his paw. The pads were cracked and raw, dark red against his dirty fur. He hadn't whimpered once. Marcus emerged from the deeper cavern behind them, his expression grim, carrying the small backpack they had found near Olivia. Inside were 2 granola bars, a cracked compass, and a plastic flashlight that no longer worked. The kind of pack a child might take on a field trip. He looked at Sarah. She said he left her but didn't say where he went. Sarah stood, her breath steaming in the cold. "He won't have gone far." Her voice was low calm, but inside something sharp twisted in her gut. Olivia's words had pierced something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Rage. Not the wildfire kind, but slow, cold, and precise. She scanned the woods beyond the cave, her gaze following the broken trail of footprints half filled with fresh snow. They didn't belong to a child. Ranger stirred suddenly. He pushed up on trembling legs and sniffed the air. His ears rotated forward. Then, despite his limp, he began walking, veering east into a thicket of dark spruce. Sarah and Marcus exchanged a glance, then followed. The trees thickened quickly, their trunks pressed close, like the ribs of a sleeping beast. Underbrush scratched their legs, and the temperature dropped sharply. The trail twisted downhill into a hollow between two ridges, and that's when they saw it, tarp sheets stretched over sticks and branches, forming the shell of a crude lean-to. Around it, signs of long occupation, rusted cans, scavenged sleeping bags, plastic water jugs turned brittle with age. A tarp flapped lazily in the wind, revealing a stack of children's shoes, tiny, mismatched, weather-worn. Some had names written inside the soles. Marcus drew in a breath. Jesus? Then a sound faint shuffling came from inside the shelter. Sarah stepped forward, hand resting on her belt near the sidearm she almost never used. "Come out!" she called, her voice level, hands visible. Now. A figure emerged, slowly hunched and wrapped in layers of wool and canvas. He looked like a scarecrow built from scraps. His beard was overgrown and wild, streaked with white. His skin was ruddy and wind-burned, his eyes pale blue, too. Pale darted from Marcus to Sarah, then to Ranger, who stood stiff and silent, growling low in his throat. The man raised his hands, palms outward. "I didn't hurt them," he said. His voice was high and cracked like it had forgotten how to be used. "I just needed to get them away." Sarah took a slow step forward. Away from what? The noise, the cities, the watchers, the poison in the air. His eyes jittered again. They were too clean, too visible. Marcus moved to the side, quietly flanking. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice even. The man licked his lips. "Henry." "But that's not my real name. They changed it." "Who's they?" Henry's eyes flicked toward the trees as if someone might be listening. "They sent me to the place in Grand Junction. But I didn't belong there. I see things clearer. I hear them through the trees. The children they heard, too." Sarah's stomach dropped. She remembered an alert from last year, an escapee from the Ridgeview Psychiatric Facility. A patient once committed after abducting a child from a playground, claiming he was saving her from the transmissions. The girl had been found unharmed, but Henry, as he'd been identified, had vanished into the mountains. Sarah signaled with 2 fingers. Marcus moved quickly. Henry barely reacted. He raised his hands higher, still muttering about radio signals and clean skies. Marcus closed in behind him and secured his wrists with a zip tie. "I didn't hurt them," Henry repeated as Marcus patted him down. "I gave them stories, fire, warmth. I taught them to listen to the trees." Sarah stepped closer to the lean-to, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened leaves. Inside, beneath the crude bedding, she found a notebook, pages filled with scribbled messages, diagrams of trees, spirals, and eyes, names, drawings of children holding hands. One page simply read, "Purity is silence." She swallowed. They found more wrappers from energy bars, a child's mitten, a doll with its face drawn over in charcoal. In a battered plastic tub were water-stained documents, newspaper clippings about missing children from across the region. Some had been safely recovered. Some had not. Henry's scrawl traced the margins. Marcus led him toward the trail with slow, careful steps. Henry didn't resist. He only stared at Ranger as they passed. That one, he whispered. He remembered. Didn't he? Sarah said nothing. Ranger stood at her side, panting hard, his front paw barely touching the ground. His body trembled with exhaustion, but he didn't take his eyes off Henry. Not until he disappeared down the slope. Sarah sank onto a log, her knees suddenly weak. Her hands trembled as she removed her gloves. The notebook sat heavy in her pack. Olivia's face flickered in her mind. Then Ellie. Then Liam. She looked at Ranger. His face was streaked with dried blood and snowmelt. He leaned against her leg, his weight solid. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean back, resting her hand gently on his head. "You brought us to him," she whispered. "You knew." Ranger didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply pressed closer, eyes closed, finally letting the weight settle. Night had fallen by the time they reached the ranger station, the horizon a deep indigo where pine trees cut dark silhouettes against the stars. The wind had quieted, replaced by the soft crunch of boots on fresh snow, and the low rhythmic breaths of the dog beside them. Ranger limped heavily now. His paw left faint smears of blood across the powdery trail, but he refused to be carried or left behind. He kept moving step for step, always watching, always guarding. Sarah walked close beside him, her parka zipped high, a scarf wrapped snug beneath her chin. Her tall frame moved with fatigue, but her eyes remained sharp, softened only when they glanced at the dog. Marcus was just ahead, guiding Henry now, zip-tied and bundled in a heavy rescue blanket toward the station porch where the sheriff's SUV was already parked waiting. The man waiting beside the vehicle was Sheriff Paul Cardenas, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a weathered face, clean-shaven jaw, and a deep furrow between his brows that never quite went away. Known for being stoic, practical, and fair, Paul had served the county for almost 3 decades. He raised a flashlight toward the trio as they approached, frowning at the sight of Henry, then at the battered state of Sarah and Marcus. Sarah gave a short nod. "We found our man." Paul squinted at Henry, then turned to Sarah. "And the kid's safe," she replied. "In the hospital, thanks to Ranger." Paul's gaze dropped to the dog, who stood still in the snow chest, heaving paw, trembling, but his eyes never left the back of the SUV where the children had last sat. Paul gave a solemn nod. "He's something else." Minutes later, an ambulance pulled into the lot with a quiet growl. EMTs in winter jackets approached quickly, checking Ranger first, then gently wrapping his paw. The dog growled softly but didn't resist. Sarah stood back, arms crossed, feeling both protective and strangely powerless. One of the medics, Elena, a petite, fast-moving woman with freckles and dark braids tucked under her cap, looked up at her. "He's stable for now, but this paw needs real attention. We'll bring him with us." Sarah hesitated. "I'll go with him." Marcus, bruised and worn, but still alert, raised a brow. "I'll ride with the sheriff, follow up on the paperwork." Sarah nodded. "I'll call you when I know more." The hospital was warm, fluorescent, and far too bright after days in the woods. Sarah sat beside Ranger in the ER waiting bay, watching the way his body rose and fell with the rhythm of sleep. His coat had been gently cleaned, a bandage wrapped tight around his paw. A technician had shaved part of his side to check for internal bruising. He looked older now, worn thin but peaceful. She reached down and touched his fur. A nurse passed by, pausing to whisper, "You're lucky." He made it through worse than most humans could. Sarah didn't reply. She knew. Ranger hadn't just survived, he had carried others with him. Later that night, a nurse entered and led her to another wing. Inside were 2 small hospital beds side by side. Liam lay in one, tubes connected to his arm, but his skin had regained color. Olivia lay in the other, clutching a stuffed bear and sleeping soundly. Beside her sat a young woman, Ava, Olivia's mother, early 30s, red hair, pulled into a bun, face pale from days of panic. She looked up at Sarah with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "You're the ranger who found them," she whispered. Sarah nodded, voice low. "I was with them, but it was the dog who led us." Ava looked toward the window. "Then he saved more than just my daughter." Sarah stayed for a while, long enough to hear Liam murmur in his sleep. The dog came back. "Told you." She smiled through tired tears and left the room. By morning, she was sitting in the hospital courtyard, coffee in hand. Snow lightly falling, she pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time. Then she finally pressed the contact. It rang only once. Sarah came a voice deep, familiar, cautious. It was Tom, her ex-husband. She took a long breath. "Hi, I know it's been a while. I needed to hear your voice." There was a pause, then quiet warmth. "Are you okay?" "No," she said softly. "But I think I'm getting there." They talked, not for long, not about the past, but enough to ease the silence that had lived between them since Maddie's death. When she hung up, her hands felt steadier. Later that afternoon, the vet came to find her. Ranger was in recovery, stable, but weak. "He'll need time," the vet said, "but he's got fight in him." Sarah stepped into the room, where Ranger lay on a thick blanket. His eyes opened as she approached tail, giving a faint wag. She crouched beside him. "You're not going back out there," she said gently. "You've done enough." Ranger blinked slowly as if agreeing. She hesitated a moment, then added, "I put in the paperwork. To keep you." His tail thumped harder. "You saved them," she whispered. "Maybe you saved me too." Spring came slowly to Evergreen, as if the town had to earn every blade of green. The snow lingered longer in the valleys, and the mountain air remained crisp, even as the sun pushed through stubborn clouds. The forests that had once swallowed secrets now stood tall, peaceful, and watched by more careful eyes. The ranger station had changed too. A new wooden sign had been carved and placed near the front steps, weather-sealed and adorned with a copper engraving of a German shepherd. Beneath the image, the inscription read, "Ranger, the one who remembered." People stopped to look at it as they passed some left flowers, others small toys, and some just placed a hand over their heart before walking on. Inside the station, Ranger lay on a thick padded bed beside Sarah's desk, his bandaged paw now healed into a scar that would never fully disappear. His fur had grown back thick and golden, his eyes bright again. Though older than he looked, Ranger had taken to his new life with quiet dignity. He didn't chase balls or bark at mail carriers. He just watched, protected, listened. And every morning at dawn, he still walked to the edge of the tree line, sat for a few minutes, then returned as if checking that the forest still slept and the children were safe. Sarah sat at her desk that morning, a mug of hot tea steaming gently in her hands. Her long limbs were curled under her chair, her ranger uniform neatly pressed. Her eyes no longer held the brittle weariness they once had. There was still sadness in them, but it no longer ruled her. It shared space now with something warmer. Hope. Her hair was still tucked beneath a knit cap, though now she wore a red one knitted by a child who once shivered in a cave and now laughed in a classroom. The door swung open, and Marcus entered, arms full of hand-painted signs. "Guess what day it is?" He grinned. Sarah arched a brow. "Ranger Day." Marcus laughed, brushing snow from his jacket. "You say it like it's not a real holiday." She smiled. "Did you get roped into face painting again?" "Second grade," he said, grimacing. "Glitter. Everywhere." They both laughed, and even Ranger let out a soft huff of amusement. Across town at Evergreen Elementary, the hallways were buzzing with excitement. Children wore paper ears, hand-drawn badges, and shirts that read, "Be brave like Ranger." The gymnasium had been transformed into a forest scene made from cardboard trees and cotton snow. At the center stood a mural 6 feet wide, painted in watercolor hues, of a German shepherd beneath tall pines, his tail curled protectively around a group of smiling children. Olivia, now in 3rd grade, stood proudly beside it, holding a smaller version in her hands. Her brown hair was tied back in a ponytail, cheeks flushed with pride. Her teacher, Ms. Carpenter, a gentle woman with round glasses and a sweater covered in dog pins, introduced her to the assembly. Olivia was one of the children rescued by Ranger. She said, her voice warm. And today, she has something to share. Olivia stepped up, cleared her throat, and read from a note written in careful block letters. "Ranger is not just a dog. He is our protector. He is our friend. When I was scared, he came for me. When I cried, he didn't leave. He made me feel brave even when I wasn't." The room went quiet except for the sound of a single tail tapping against a gym floor. Sarah stood at the back with Tom, her ex-husband, who had come back to town just after winter thawed. He had aged as she had, Line's deeper voice lower. But the pain between them had begun to lose its edge. They had started walking together again. Talking. Healing. Sometimes silence was enough. Tom leaned down and whispered, "She's amazing." Sarah nodded, her eyes misting. So is he. At the end of the event, the children were invited to visit Ranger. He sat near the exit, wearing a new harness with a small stitched patch that read, "Honor Dog." He let them pet him one by one, never flinching, never tiring. When Olivia approached, she knelt beside him, holding out her drawing. Ranger sniffed it, then looked at her, his eyes soft. "It's you," she said simply. "I made you tall and strong, like a tree." Ranger wagged his tail once. That night, after the town had gone quiet and the lights in the school dimmed, Sarah walked Ranger home under a sky filled with stars. The air smelled of thawed earth and pine. She paused outside her cabin, watching as Ranger moved to the edge of the yard and stared out into the dark forest. "You still watching over them?" she asked. He turned, walked to her, and pressed his nose gently into her hand. She looked down at him. "You found them, Ranger. And maybe somehow, you found me too." He leaned against her leg, not with weight but with trust. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles wrapped in light. He sends them limping through the snow, silent, wounded, but unwavering. Ranger didn't come to be rescued. He came to remind us that love still fights, even when it's broken. In his quiet strength, we saw something divine that even in our darkest hours, God is near walking beside us in the most unexpected forms. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment to tell us what it reminded you of. And if you believe God still sends miracles even on 4 tired paws, type Amen below. May God bless you and every quiet hero He sends your way. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, hope, and healing.